From the University of Leicester in the United Kingdom, this is Glenn Fulshire with another issue of Language Testing Bytes. In issue 32 of Language Testing, we publish a paper by Paula Winke, Susan Gass and Carol Myford on rater second language background as a source of bias in the assessment of speaking. We've known about rater bias for a long time and regularly take measures to control for it, but it's only recently that research into the sources of bias has found its way into the literature. In this podcast, Laura Ballard stands in for me to ask Paula Winke and Susan Gass about their research into rater bias, as recording took place on site at Michigan State University, where they all work. So I would like to thank not only the authors, but Laura and the Michigan technicians for their work on this podcast.
Thank you for coming on Language Testing Bytes to discuss rater bias with readers of language testing.
Well, thanks for having us.
Thank
we
you.
appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Language testers and educational measurement researchers have known about rater bias for a long time. Perhaps we can ask you to describe what task raters are asked to perform in speaking tests and what rater bias is.
Oh, that's a great question. So Susan Gass, Carol Myford, and I are very interested in this question. And what we'd like to look at is, the rating process and the outcomes of that. So we're interested in when raters are trained, they learn how to orient themselves to the tasks that are being assessed in the speaking assessment, the characteristics of speech. So when raters are trained, then they rate the speech samples, and we hope that there is no bias, that they're not rating any characteristic that's not on the rating rubric. So something like a bias could be raters who are harsher, giving worse scores to people who are females because they, for some reason, don't like a high-pitched voice. That would be unwanted variation in test scores related to some characteristic that's not on the rubric.
You say that bias can be caused by a number of different factors. Can you outline these factors and say which you have found to be the most serious?
Well, researchers have looked at bias and to see what factors. Some of the researchers have looked at occupation, the level of English teaching experience, how that affects their scores that they give, and also their familiarity with the accent. And familiarity can be the accent of the speaker taking the test. An accent can be measured in different ways. So exposure to the test taker's L1, or what we were interested in our study is even a low level of familiarity in terms of exposure to the accent through foreign language instruction.
Now, one of the factors you mentioned is the linguistic background of the raters. In what ways can this affect how a rater awards a score to a candidate in a speaking test?
Well, this actually gets into our particular study, and what we did in our study was look at how a language that a rater knows, how knowing a language, either because it's spoken in the home, when they were growing up, so-called heritage language, or because they studied the language, as Paula just mentioned, or even because they lived abroad, and how that knowing that language can influence a rater as they are evaluating speech samples. So we know that comprehension is facilitated when one is familiar with a particular foreign language, or even when a rater may know foreign languages in general, is used to hearing non-native speakers of their language, for example, in the classroom. So that can facilitate comprehension. So what we set out to do was to find out how that might translate into the situation where they have to rate speech samples, such as the kinds of speech samples that are given in standardized tests, TOEFL being the one that we looked at. And what we found was that there was such a bias when we matched them up with the native language of the test taker and the particular experience that the rater had had in a particular language. We matched that up. And we did find that there was more language leniency when for Spanish raters with Spanish experience and with Chinese experience. They were more lenient when they were rating Spanish native speakers and Chinese native speakers, We also had a group of Koreans, and the same was found in terms of there was greater leniency, although for Koreans it did not reach the level of statistical significance, although we do think that that may have been due in part to the small sample size that we had for Korean.
Of great interest to many people listening to this discussion is the methodologies that we might use to investigate rater bias. I suppose the multifaceted Roche analysis has been the most commonly used tool. Can you talk a little bit about the methodologies we have at our disposal and how they are used, and perhaps give one or two examples?
It's true that Roche analysis with item response theory is one of the most popular methods, because with that, as opposed to classical test theory, is you can have a larger number of speech samples and a larger number of raters, but the raters don't have to rate every single speech sample. So you can do a design where there's some common items that all raters rate, and use that to balance the scale across the different raters and rating the different speech samples. So a lot of the studies that have appeared in language testing have looked at rater bias in terms of Roche measurement. But there are other ways too, and we're starting to see more studies that are looking at qualitative data as well. So Susan Gass and I have done a second study with this data where we invited the raters to come in and be interviewed and through a stimulated recall protocol where they watch themselves rating, and we asked them what they were thinking at that time. And sometimes they do discuss their rater bias in relation to accent familiarity. We have a paper coming out that uses that methodology in TESOL Quarterly in 2013.
And it was interesting also to follow up on that with some of the comments that they made. Oh, that reminded me of my grandfather or something like that. So these would be heritage language speakers. So when they hear this speech, it does conjure up images for them that, and it was through that particular methodology that you could find that out. You wouldn't know that if you were just looking at the raw data.
I suppose that the primary goal of this research is to understand rater bias so that we can either eradicate it or control it in some way. How do we use the findings from rater bias studies to make performance testing more fair?
Well, some of it is just knowledge, finding out more about raters, what languages they have studied, how well they might know them, what might be heritage language, who might be a heritage language speaker. So I think knowledge is important, and then bring that into rater training programs and discuss it as part of what's not to be included in the rubric. So it's really just gaining more information about the raters and then openly discussing it and determining to what extent heavy accents, for example, should or should not be included in the decisions that we make. I don't know if you have anything else to add.
And I think one of the theoretical questions is how can we tease apart for raters the problem of disassociating problems in pronunciation with problems in identifying and deciphering characteristics that come from accent. So those are very hard to distinguish, but it's something that needs to be discussed in rater training programs, because accent isn't supposed to be part of the rating rubric, but sometimes it is when people have a hard time understanding because of the accent.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say that you can tell people not to conjure up images of their grandfathers, but then what they do with that information, that not to translate it into a particular scoring issue.
Improving test fairness through reducing or eliminating rater bias is clearly a critical issue for testing speaking in particular. And I'd like to thank you for taking the time to explain some of the issues at stake.
Well, thanks for giving us this opportunity.
We enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you for listening to this issue of Language Testing Bytes. Language Testing Bytes is a production of the journal Language Testing from Sage Publications. You can subscribe to Language Testing Bytes through iTunes, or you can download future issues from ltj.sagepub.com or from languagetesting.info. So, until next time, we hope you enjoy the current issue of Language Testing.